can we just go back a step further and talk about IBD and what IBD is? And
we can start wherever you like.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's go back to the fundamentals.
Yep.
So IBD.
So IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, basically describes a chronic, by which I mean long-term condition of inflammation within the gut. There's two main types of IBD. There's Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, and they're both slightly different. I'm going to come on to that in a wee second. But I suppose if you're thinking about what's inflammation within the gut, well, if you had a spot on your nose, it's red, it's tender, it's sore, you can see that there's inflammation there. And in IBD, you have a similar amount of inflammation but around the gut in different places, and where that is impacts on what the symptoms are of the person who has that condition. And for reasons we don't fully understand, when you get IBD, that's then part of your journey forever, in the same way that when you get epilepsy or diabetes or whatever, that label is associated with you forever. So currently, and I need to lean on Billy Connolly here. So Billy Connolly, when he was given a Parkinson's diagnosis, his doctor said to him, "There's no cure." And he said, "That's a terrible thing to say to people. And don't say that, because it takes hope away. It's better to say there's no cure yet, or we're still working on a cure." And that's the case with IBD. You know,
right.
There's a lot of research, a lot of interest in IBD, what causes it, how we might treat it. But right now in 2022, if we give someone a diagnosis of inflammatory bowel disease, we're giving them that for the rest of their life. And we're saying this is a part of you and your journey. And we have lots of good treatments for IBD to drive the disease into what we call remission, which is where we switch off that inflammation, the gut heals, the symptoms go away, but we don't have any curative therapies. Okay, so
understood.
So that inflammation, so in Crohn's disease, that inflammation can be any part of the gut from the mouth down to the bottom, and can skip areas where there's healthy and then unhealthy throughout. Sometimes that can cause narrowing of the bowel. Sometimes it can cause abnormal connections between parts of the bowel. Ulcerative colitis, on the other hand, just affects the last part of the gut, the colon. Okay, this symptoms are affected by, or the symptoms are influenced by where the inflammation is in the gut. So if you've got inflammation in the last part of your gut, it tends to cause diarrhea, blood in the stools. Higher up, it might cause abdominal pain, because it's your gut and it's got a job to do, and that inflammation's around there and getting in the way, and also it speeds up things going through. Sometimes it can lead to malnutrition, weight loss, loss of energy. In my population, pediatrics, delay in puberty, delays in growth and things like that. So it's pretty significant and serious conditions.
You mentioned pediatrics. Why do you think people are getting it earlier in life and some people are getting it later in life? What's driving that, do you think?
So it's a really great question. And so we're definitely seeing more inflammatory bowel disease year on year than we were seeing before. And every time anyone looks at that in the West, they're able to kind of describe that the curve is increasing generally. But we're also seeing in pediatrics, we're seeing it getting younger. So it's affecting patients who are younger. When I started doing this, it tended to be teenagers who came through the door. Increasingly, it's kids who are in the primary school ages. And
really?
Yeah, and
Goodness me.
Even more than that, we're seeing more and more children who are under 5 coming in with inflammatory bowel disease. So it's now it used to be, when I started my career, not that long ago,
wow,
it was really rare to see somebody who was under 5 with inflammatory bowel disease, and now we have a small cohort of them, and it's not unusual to see a new one every year.
I mean, I can't remember that much from my medical school days, but I can remember, late teens, early adulthood, sometimes early teens is when people would first be diagnosed. That I'd never heard of. Yeah, less than 5.
No, so it's changing a lot.
It's incredible.
And
why is that?
So why is that? Yeah. Great question. So our genetics hasn't changed over that time. Our epigenetics, which is about how our genes are switched on and switched off through processes that can influence them, might have changed a little bit over that time. And those two might influence how our immune system works and how our immune system recognizes the bacteria that are in the gut. Probably year on year, the bacteria that are in our gut are changing. So I suppose if you compare somebody who lives in a more traditional lifestyle in Africa against someone who lives in the West, you'll probably see they've got fewer bacterial species within their gut. What we call in the West, yeah. So what we call bacterial diversity. And that's probably linked to the changes in our dietary patterns over many decades. So our food sources have become less complex, more convenient, probably less orientated towards fruits and vegetables, more towards, I forgot the word for this now.
Non-digestible carbohydrates.
So non-digestible.
We're not getting enough fiber.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So our whole way of eating as a species has shifted, and probably our ways of being associated with each other and being connected to each other as a community have shifted. Our exposure to antibiotics has changed. We're delivering more babies by cesarean section. So lots of things within society. Not any of these is individually causative, but lots of things have changed for us as a species over the last 100, 150, 200 years that have fundamentally transformed our biology and how we are colonized by a bacteria and how we interact with those bacteria. And that's probably set up the right conditions for inflammatory bowel disease to happen in particular individuals. There will still be people who will get through all that and live through a whole life and never get inflammatory bowel disease. But there are people who for some reason, the setup of their genetics, their immune system, their baseline bacterial, there's very limited data on this. And then something comes along and sets them off.
Triggers that.
Yeah, I call that the Humpty Dumpty conundrum, because that's when once he falls off the wall, you can't put him back together again the same way ever again. But based on doing that, you then drive yourself into inflammatory bowel disease. That might be a course of antibiotics. That might be an infection with a Campylobacter or a Salmonella. That might be you've gone to Tunisia on holiday, and anecdotally, you've heard all of these things come to you in clinic where he was fine and then he did this and then this happened. But similarly, again, I would reiterate, lots of people go to Tunisia or have antibiotics or have an infection.
They don't get IBD.
And they don't get IBD. So that's the part that's difficult for us to explain.
Super interesting. Some of the triggers you just described there are also similar triggers to people that have psoriasis, for example, and they start to see the plaques for the first time. So maybe there's just something to do with the interaction between the microbiome and the immune system that's triggered by something. And in some people that produce a problem in their gut, in others it produces a problem with the skin based on probably their genetics.
Yeah. So it's all about setting up your immune system to respond in an appropriate way to something, whether that's your own tissue in a kind of proper autoimmune process where you're recognizing your own cells are foreign, or recognizing something that's supposed to be tolerated like the bacteria in your gut and recognizing that as foreign and causing inflammation.
So if the immune system is recognizing cells in the GI tract as foreign, why is it that in Crohn's we have these sort of skips and it can appear anywhere in the GI tract, whereas in UC it's all confined to the colon? Like, are the two different things, or is it the same process that's happening? The bugs are triggering the immune system's attacking the body, or is there different immunology between the two?
So there's definitely different immunology between the two. There's definitely different bacterial changes within the two. So if you look at various papers, then they describe different upregulation of immune cells and different colonization with bacteria. But there's a lot of fundamentals that are similar in terms of what you're seeing there. You know, you're causing this chronic inflammatory process. Quite why Crohn's leads to skip lesions, quite why it likes the last part of the small bowel and the first part of the colon, I don't know. And I think there's interesting questions to be asked there about what's going on. You know, what's the difference between 2 centimeters of bowel where one part's really inflamed and the next part is perfectly fine? And I can't answer that part for you, but you know, it's a fascinating question, and I think understanding it. Similarly, ulcerative colitis, often you can see in ulcerative colitis, so it's a disease that is classically described as going proximally from the rectum upwards. So it's in continuity from the rectum for an amount of colon. And actually in adults, it's often just left-sided. In children, it usually involves most of the colon, if not all of the colon. But you will often see where there's quite a clear demarcation, where it's literally like going from night to day. There's inflamed ulcerative colitis colon and then normal colon above that. Wow. And what's that about? What's going on there? Why isn't it continuous? Why doesn't it affect everything? Or what's going on in that part? What's going on in that part that protects it? I don't know that.
Are there theories for that, like that people postulate, or is it more of a it happens and we'll figure it out at some point?
I think probably the latter.
Probably the latter, yeah. But so over the course of your career, then, how has the relative importance or the perceived importance of the microbiome changed? You know, going back to your first interest in 2004.
Yeah. Like,
were you one of the only people that was interested in the microbiome and gastroenterology?
I mean, I think I'm kind of lucky because I got interested in this. So as I say, I cut off that story to talk about what IBD was. But in about 2004, I kind of realized that there was this, people who were starting to talk about gut bacteria, about probiotics, about colonization. You know, at that time, I probably hadn't quite decided between being a neonatologist or being a gastroenterologist, and neonatologists look after very sick infants, and a lot of them, not a lot of them, that's not true, but some of them who are the most fragile and most premature will get a condition called necrotizing enterocolitis, which is a bit like a sort of short-term severe IBD that burns itself out. So it's got very similar features in a lot of ways, and it's certainly driven by, there's definitely an association with bacteria in the gut and colonization of the gut and the introduction of foodstuffs to these premature babies. But it's also a very different process. And I got quite interested in that, and I got interested in this emergence of probiotics and whether this was going to, you know, there was a lot of buzz about how it would start to change things and make new therapies available. And that didn't really play out, but it kind of sparked my curiosity. And then I had an opportunity to go and do a PhD looking at what was happening in gut bacteria in inflammatory bowel disease. And I did that with Professor Georgina Holt and Professor Ima Delomar at Aberdeen, University of Aberdeen. And when I started that project, the way that you would describe the gut bacteria or the microbiome, so the microbiome describing all the bacteria that live with you, was to basically clone individual strands of DNA into different E. coli and grow them up on lots of plates. And the more plates you did, the more bacteria you could sequence and find out what they were. And so you could do this on 100 different plates with 100 different bacteria and then get them all. And it was essentially, it was a very slow and laborious and challenging process.
Was that the state of the art?
That was the state of the art.
That was the state of the art at the time.
When I started my PhD in about 2009.
Wow.
But during that period, there was the emergence of this thing called next generation sequencing, where instead of putting all those strands of DNA that relate to all the different bacteria into E. coli cells to grow them up, they bound to little beads and dropped into a little well on a big machine. And if you paid enough money to get enough of these wells sequenced on a big machine, you could sequence the microbiome in a kind of almost in a single step, not quite in a single step, but compared to that previous method. And you used to be limited by how many E. coli you could grow up on plates, maybe 100, and then you were limited basically by the budget of how many little wells you bought on the sequencing machine, which was called sequencing reads when it comes out the other end. And so you were suddenly going to 30,000, 50,000, however many, you know. And I think that's where the game started to change, because you suddenly had a way of being able to do this which was quicker, more efficient, more detailed. You were getting much deeper sequencing of what was going on. And it started to take over really medicine, actually, and science. And you start to see these big papers coming out that are describing what is and isn't going on with the gut microbiome. And I suppose along the way, people got very interested in this concept of microbial therapeutics, which is, okay, we're describing this thing. We know it's important. We can see that there are 300 to 400 bacterial species in someone's gut. We see that there are differences in ups and downs depending on what disease state you're describing. How do we actually harness that? How do we change that? And I suppose, to me, I think we're still in that revolution. I don't think I think it has taken off, but I don't think it's quite gone full logarithmic acceleration phase yet. And the excited part of me is that I think that's still to come. And I think we will see big changes to, for instance, inflammatory bowel disease management, but maybe many other human conditions through the advent of microbial therapeutics.